We are into architecture today. We are following up on what we started with our Monday lecture on sculpture, and we are moving now into architecture. And you might remember we talked a little bit about the fact that architecture has functional inner space, and that is what separates it from sculpture. So we're going to dig a little further into these concepts. So for architecture, it's incredibly important. It's what we live our lives in. Architecture shapes our culture, our identity, our way of life, and vice versa. Our life, our culture shapes our architecture. And so it's very, very important aspect of the humanities. And it continues to shape our current reality, just like it shaped the reality of the past. We can think about how some buildings maybe have disappeared over time, but some have survived. Some are thousands of years old. You could look at the Parthenon. You could look at you could look at the Roman ruins. You could look at the Colosseum. You can look at the Great Wall. And so we can think about these aspects of architecture that have stood the test of time. And architecture and history are very closely intertwined. So if history is something that's interesting to you, there's a lot to dig in here. Buildings and dwellings have changed as people have changed. Of course, way back when, we know people lived in tents in the very early biblical days. And then, we've come all the way to castles and mansions and skyscrapers and beyond. And so there's some really great moments of innovation that have taken place over this period of human history. Somebody had to make that first pyramid, and someone had to build the first church. Someone had to make the first teepee. So there's been these great moments of innovation as people have changed architecture based on function, but also based on the values that were important in the culture that they lived in. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But changes in power, religion, trade, ecology, all of those things have affected architecture over time. So architecture, if we wanted to try to put a definition on it, and this would be your text's definition. So architecture is the creative space shaping or conservation of buildings and space. So there's a difference between architecture and just a work of engineering. Anybody can put together some 2x4s or some metal posts and throw up a shelter, but that doesn't mean that is a creative shaping or conservation of space. So there is this creative, expressive aspect to a work of architecture. And we can think about architecture like a hollowed out sculpture that we can actually go inside and walk around. We can be inside of it. And it is functional, very, very important. It should be both practical, but it should also be interesting. Practical, but interesting. Okay. This is an important term that your text will talk about, this idea of centered space. What is centered space? It is a site, either natural site or a human-made site, that organizes the place around it. Essentially, it is the arrangement of things, your text says, the arrangement of things around some paramount thing, meaning it's something important, it's something central that sort of draws us in. And it's a place where inner space and outer space can converge together. That's where architecture comes in, creating that inner space. This could be a natural site. It could be a mountain. It could be a river, canyon, forest. And it's important to remember that a work of architecture can enhance that site, that centered space, or it can detract from it. And a good architect will try to enhance the space that's already there and not take away from it. This concept of living space, your text talks about. Living space is the comfortable positioning of things in the environment. So if we think about our living spaces where we live, our homes, we want to think about things that are important to us. And one of those things is having clear paths. We want to position things in a way that is comfortable for us to move around. We have liberty of movement, and it creates paths as directives. So if we didn't have a hallway, we would have to walk from one bedroom to the next bedroom to the next bedroom. So we have paths that are important. So that's part of living space. It's the comfortable positioning of things that allows us to live our lives in the best way possible. Um, so the whole body is a center because it invokes our senses. So if we think about um, the temperature of your house. Do you like it at 65? Do you like it 75? The candles that you use, the scent that's there, visual elements. Maybe you feel the breeze of the fan on your face, or what sounds do you hear? The living space invokes our senses. And when we have this place of special value, like a home, we consider that a configurational center. A configurational center is formed, a gathering point around which a field of interest is structured. And what I would like to maybe say is, a lot of people say that the kitchen is the heart of the home. I don't know about you guys, but whenever we have people over, everybody's gathered around the island in the kitchen, even though there's nowhere to sit. There's only a couple seats there, but that's where everybody wants to be. So I would consider that to be a configurational center in my home. To oversimplify this, we could say that for Romans, the city of Rome was their configurational center. It was the place that they felt like they most naturally belonged. So even if they weren't living in Rome or near Rome, they considered it kind of their home. It's like it was their mothership, if you will. And so that was considered their configurational center. All right. So what is the role of the architect? Well, an architect is a shepherd of space. That's what your text would call them, a shepherd of space. We talked a little bit about space with sculpture, and space is important, right? Because just like a sculpture, a work of architecture, it extends out into space. There's no boundary between us and it. It shapes the space around it. And so we want to think about what is a work of architecture doing to the space around it. So their job is to perceive a center of space and then to preserve or enhance it. So an architect actually has a lot of different jobs. Obviously, they need to know how to be an engineer. They need to be able to construct something that's sound, something that's not going to crumble in 2 years. But they also need to be psychologists. All right. So how does a person's mind work, and what what does a person relate to? What makes them feel a sense of hominess? Sociology. How do people relate to each other? They need to be economists. They need to think about the budget. They're business people. What's the bottom line on this? And are we on budget? Are we under budget? And politicians. So they need to wear a lot of hats. And they also need to account for the 4 necessities of architecture, which we're going to talk about. And so really, in a lot of ways, the architect is an artist. They have to determine a vision for the space. They need to be able to see what's not there yet and how that proposed building is going to work on that center of space. So here are the 4 necessities of architecture. We're going to take them one by one, but we won't spend too much time here. So the technical requirements, that's our first one here: technical, functional, spatial, and revelatory. So technical requirements, these are the most obvious, okay? A building must stand and withstand. That's hopefully 101. If you're going to create a building, it needs to stand. Number 2, an architect needs to know their materials. What's going to work here? What's going to stand over time? What materials work best in which climates? And then they need to know how the materials will work on a site, how they work in a specific location. So an architect should be an engineer. They should be an artist. Okay. Next, it should have functional requirements. At the end of the day, a building is going to reveal its function or use. And so let's take these 2 for an example here. We've got a cathedral in France, and then we've got the Seagram building in, I think this is New York, either New York or Chicago, I can't remember. And so how does each building reveal its function? What's it used for? So if we take a moment to look at each of these, we could also think, what's the subject matter here? We can argue that both works are architecture because the form of each one reveals its subject matter. So we've got on the left-hand side this cathedral. This is in the Gothic style. And there's a lot of intense detail here. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of anguish and striving, and we can see how tall and pointed those spires are. And ultimately, we could think about how, how tall that is. It's almost like trying to reach heaven. So we have, and ultimately, if we look at, the detail here, we know this was constructed over possibly decades. The Seagram building, probably not so much. So there's really a lot of value put into what's going to outlive us. Because those architects that maybe started on this cathedral, maybe some of them didn't even see its completion, or maybe didn't even really get to enjoy it much before they passed on. And so they're really investing into something that's going to live on forever. So we can think about, this idea of trying to reach heaven, or, this ornate style, because we want to give God the best. So it would make sense that this would be a church. It would be a cathedral. Whereas on the right-hand side, we've got the Seagram building, and we can see that its function is probably a little bit more streamlined. It's sort of stripped down. It's very American business. We're just here to make money and not much else. It's not fancy. It's certainly not constructed over decades. It's here to do a job. So it's very American. Okay. Then we have spatial requirements. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It needs to occupy space, just like sculpture does. And so, for example, and it needs to occupy space like a sculpture would. We could look at the Guggenheim, which is the image here. This is in New York City. What else could it be but a museum? So its space, the way it takes up space, should make sense for what it is. And a work of architecture should go beyond just form and function and should occupy space like a sculpture might. So it does have those spatial requirements. Okay. The next one is revelatory. So the building should reveal not only its function, we talked about functional requirements and its values, but also its values. So an architect should be and is, whether even they're not, whether they're aware of it or not, they are influenced by the values of their society. So we could think about going back to our two pictures of the cathedral and the Seagram building. What were the values of a medieval society when that was built? And then what are the values of 1950s USA? And so it should reveal values. So we can see how important the church was back then, that people would spend this much time to create something so intricate. The height of this building, the centrality of this building. Back in medieval times, the church was the center of society. It was essentially like a community center. That's where people would go to get married. That's where people would go to be buried. That's where town hall meetings would happen. It was the center. It was the hub of everything that happened in medieval life. Whereas we have the Seagram building, and 1950s America, that's after the war, is just worried about, the American dream and making as much money as possible and being successful. And so we can see how those works of architecture show the values of each society and how they were different. Okay. All right. I'm going to give you a brief little timeline of some changes that happened to architecture over time. So you can kind of see where architecture has come and kind of bringing us up to closer to today. So I'm going to start with post and lintel construction, and you can see this is this is a great example. This is the Parthenon in Greece, in Athens, which I got to see, which is pretty neat, several years ago. And this is the post and lintel construction. So the posts being obviously going up and down, and then the lintel being sort of this triangular, really like a flat shape on top. And that was one of the earliest feats of architecture. Kind of looks like a pi sign. So two posts and then a flat top. And you could pass through that like a doorway. And so the Greeks then enhanced that by adding this triangular shape on top. And that's called the pediment. And it was for better weight distribution. And so it was able to stand for longer. And so as we look at this, and obviously we're just looking at a small image of it, but you can imagine, look how small the people are compared to the temple. What feeling or sense might you gain from this building? Well, it's on a hilltop. It's the highest point in Athens. It's overlooking the whole city. You can see all the way to the sea. It's huge. It's very imposing. It's very symmetrical, very, straight lines, same number of columns, very regimented, um, and dedicated to the gods. So it makes a lot of sense. First of all, its location. It's the highest to heaven, to the heavens. Its regularity and, its beauty. So you can see again how architecture relates to the values behind it. So this is kind of an improvement on the post and lintel construction. Then we have the Romans, who were the inventors of many things, but one of those things was the arch. So this was a great feat in weight distribution. It much more easily could support massive structures, so things could be built taller and stronger with arches. This is the Basilica Nova in Rome. Then we move into the Romanesque, which is more of a medieval time. And this is an improvement on the Roman arch. You can see here those arches with the pillars around them, the round pillars. So again, even more reinforced, a little less blocky and a little more airy looking. You can see the barrel vault ceiling was also invented right around this time. This is what we call Romanesque. So it's like the Roman stuff, but sort of improved. Okay. So then we move into the Gothic era. This is Saint Denis Cathedral. This was the very first cathedral in the Gothic style. It's just outside Paris. And you can see that use of the barrel vault ceiling again. And a really important update is we went from round arches to a Gothic pointed arch. Again, this is a feat of weight distribution, and this allowed buildings to be built taller. It allowed for more windows, which you can see a lot of stained glass in Gothic cathedrals, because now that they had these pointed arches, they were able to build something taller, but bring in windows without it crushing and crumbling to the ground. And so they have much more light in them than the cathedrals before them. So this was a big feat of the Gothic. We'll move into the Renaissance era. The Renaissance is really characterized by this renewal of interest in classic arts. And so when we talk about the classic period or the classical period, we're kind of referring back to the ancient Greek, the ancient Romans. So this was Renaissance era. So this is 1400s, 1500s. This is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, if you've ever been there, where the Vatican is located. And you can see that it is definitely referring back to some ancient Greek architecture. You can see the columns, you can see the regularity, you can see the symmetry. Symmetry, very, very important in classical work. But there's some Roman references as well. The columns are rounder. There's arches and domes. You see the dome at the top. That was an improvement. That was not in ancient Greece. But the reason for this was because right around the Renaissance, and honestly, a big part of the Renaissance kicking off was because there were so many scholars of ancient Greek and ancient Romans that were living in Constantinople at the time. And when the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople and made it Istanbul and kicked all of those people out, they all kind of came back into Europe and started circulating their ideas and their values around the ancient Greek works, some of the ancient literature and the art and the architecture. And that is where this revival came from. And that really is one of the main reasons that the Renaissance kicked off. All right, after Renaissance, we get into the Baroque period. This is the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, just outside Paris. Baroque, The Baroque period is very, very ornate and very decorative. It's over the top. So whenever you see something very over the top, gilded with gold and mirrors and crystal and all of that, that is very Baroque. And the reason for that is because this period was birthed out of the Counter Reformation in Italy. So if you remember some of your church history, when Martin Luther nailed those 95 Theses to the door of the Lutheran Church, he was calling out corruption in the church. And there was a reform, a big reform that happened after that. And that's where the Protestant church was born. And it was this call to simplify and, get rid of your worldly wants for wealth and goods and excess and that was all associated with the Catholic Church. And so they sort of separated themselves from everything that was Catholic. And so the Counter Reformation was a response to that. The Counter Reformation said, well, if you guys are going to leave us, we're going to be even more ornate and we're going to be even more over the top because God deserves that. And he deserves all of the gold and the ornate statues and all of this. So the Baroque period, it influenced the arts. So it was something that was happening in the church, but it was something that influenced the arts. So this is late 16th century to 18th century. So you can see that reflected here at the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. So I want to just briefly touch on these types of architecture, and then that will wrap us up for today. So 4 different types of architecture. Make sure you're using these terminologies again in your humanities engagement for this week. So make sure you're taking notes as you're watching. We've got earth-rooted, sky-oriented, earth-resting, and earth-dominating. So let's look at a few examples. The first one is earth-rooted architecture. These are buildings that bring out with special force the earth and its symbolism. They're not trying to kind of be amazing and showy on their own. They're really meant to just kind of point back to the earth itself. They're kind of meant to blend in. They draw our attention to its submission to gravity. They're often using raw materials like stone or wood or clay. So it's really kind of almost that idea of being true to materials, but with architecture. Okay, so here's some examples of earth-rooted architecture. We have on the left, this is Frank Lloyd Wright's Kaufman House. This is a really famous work of his. If you've heard of Frank Lloyd Wright, he was a very famous architect. And you can see that this building was really put on this centered space of these little waterfalls. And there's this clearing here. It's like a perfect spot for this home. And it's really kind of nestled into nature in a very organic way. It's not meant to kind of demolish everything that's there. It's really meant to just enhance what's already there. On the right, we have the Pueblo cliff dwellings in Arizona. You can see that they are very much carved into the rock. They're using the same materials as the rock, so they really blend in. It's meant to enhance what's already there and really be part of the earth rather than doing something separate. Sky-oriented architecture. These works of building really emphasize the sky. There's a lot of symbolism here. A lot of cathedrals use this sky-oriented architecture because, again, like we talked about with the Chartres Cathedral, they're pointing to the sky. They're trying to reach heaven. So this is very common in cathedrals. This is Gaudi's Sagrada Familia. If you've ever been to Barcelona, you can see that there. It's been under construction for over 100 years. I think it's either just finished or just about to be finished, so it's a very big deal. So we can think about what values is this building revealing. All right, now we've got earth resting architecture. This kind of architecture accents neither the earth nor the sky. It's just sort of a block, just resting on the earth. It's using the earth like a platform, but it's not really like organically nestled into the earth. It's just sort of resting on top of it. So you might think about what are some of the differences between this house and Frank Lloyd Wright's house. So you can kind of see some of the differences there, how this is very much integrated into the earth, and this is very much just sort of resting on top of it. Lastly, we have earth-dominating architecture. The idea here is that it rules over the earth. It doesn't just sit on it, it doesn't nestle into it, it doesn't emphasize the sky. It's just sort of imposing. There's sort of this sense of power and aggression. There's nothing organic about it. And it's just sort of, taking over. So I'm going to show you a few different examples and you can think about what kind of architecture are they. You might look at this one. This is the Long Island Federal Courthouse. Isn't that crazy? Doesn't look like a courthouse, does it? We might say it's earth resting, like it's just sort of on a platform. We could say it's earth dominating. It is quite large and imposing. So I think either of those could work. And we can think about the shapes here, and we can think about how they reveal the function of the building, maybe social values. Obviously, again, very stripped down, very modern, but there is a sense of symmetry. We could think about like the scales of justice. Hopefully they're very equal. And we've got this equality on the left side and the right side here with the courthouse. So whether that was intentional or not, I'm not sure, but it could reveal some functions there. Then we've got the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. Interesting sculpture work here, but it is architecture. But it does occupy space in a very interesting way. So you can think, is this earth resting? Is this earth rooted? Is it dominating? So something for you to think about. Here's the Taj Mahal in India. What do we think this one is? Think about that. We've got the Twin Towers in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Perhaps more sky-oriented, this one. And then lastly, the Alhambra in Granada, Spain. And I would tend to say this is more earth-rooted. I think it seems very organic in the landscape and not imposing itself on the earth. So that gives you a few examples of architecture at work. Now, normally, if we were in class together, I would have you guys get into groups to discuss. But what I would love for you to just think about, I'll just kind of leave this with you to ponder, is I want you to think about how churches have changed over time. We've talked a little bit about cathedrals. Can compare and contrast that with your own church. What does your church look like today? And what might our current church reveal about what's important to us? So if your church is in like a big warehouse type building, what might that say about what's important to us as Americans? If we have big, wide open auditorium spaces, what might that say to us about the importance of what's important to us when we worship? And what's important to us about how many people can gather at one time? So think about that. I want you to just think about how architecture has changed over time in the church. And that's kind of my little charge to you to kind of ponder this week. So don't forget that due for week 2, we are now heading into week 2. So you've got your vocab review and accountability check. You're going to take your module 2 reading quiz, and you're going to start your first humanities engagement number 1. Don't be intimidated by all the options you have in those engagements. Just choose one, something you think is the most interesting. And keep in mind that each week you do an engagement, I want you to choose something from a different category. So if you chose that first category, like the, let's say like historicize, then I'd like you to choose something from a different category next week and so on. So you get a good kind of mashup of different styles. So last reminders, nope. None of that's true. That was from last week. But I do want you to just remember that you need to visit a museum either this week or next week. This week would probably be the easiest because you're on spring break. But most students go to the Comer. Make sure you do that. And make sure, too, that you have a plan for a live performance in the next month. Go ahead and identify where you'd want to go, what you want to see and do, and grab a ticket if you need one so that you have a good plan. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Monday. Looking forward to it. And we are going to head into, let me think, I believe it is painting and photography. So we can get kickstarted on those readings. And I will see you Monday. Hope you're having a great week.